Cenote Chac Mool Cave Incident. On April 19, 2012, 3 divers entered Cenote Chac Mool in Mexico, late in the afternoon. Carlos was a 28-year-old diving guide who had worked at the cenote for 2 years. He had performed hundreds of cavern dives in the safe zone where natural light could reach. But Carlos had a dangerous secret. He wasn't certified to lead cave diving trips. That afternoon, Carlos met Marina and Eduardo, a young Brazilian couple, on their honeymoon. The newlyweds had saved for months to afford this trip to Mexico. They arrived just 1 hour before the cenote closed for the day. As they prepared their equipment, Carlos made a deadly decision. He had noticed stunning rock formations deeper in the dangerous cave zone. The 3 divers entered the water as staff began closing procedures. Carlos led Marina and Eduardo through the initial underwater passages. The water was perfectly clear with schools of fish swimming between rock formations. Marina swam close to Eduardo, amazed by the underwater cathedral-like atmosphere. As they swam deeper, Carlos began leading them away from the safe cavern zone. The natural light from the surface grew dimmer, but the couple trusted their guide. They had no way of knowing they were entering an area requiring advanced certification. The overhead openings to the surface became fewer until they disappeared entirely. They were now in the dark zone where only experienced cave divers should venture. About 80 meters from the surface, Carlos began to realize his mistake. The passage ahead split into multiple tunnels, and he wasn't sure which way led back. Marina was the first to show signs of distress in the overhead environment. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, consuming her air supply much faster. Eduardo noticed his wife's distress and tried to signal to Carlos. As Marina's air supply dwindled, panic began to set in completely. She tried to swim upward but found only solid rock overhead. The realization that she was trapped underground overwhelmed her completely. Eduardo made the fatal decision to share his air with his panicking wife. In the stress and confusion of the cave, this became nearly impossible to execute safely. Both newlyweds were now consuming Eduardo's air supply at a dangerous rate. Carlos finally realized the severity of the situation, but it was too late. Marina had already inhaled water as her air supply ran out completely. Eduardo tried desperately to save his wife, but had exhausted his own air. In the darkness with no natural light, all 3 divers became disoriented. Above the surface, the cenote had officially closed for the day. Staff noticed Carlos and his clients hadn't returned, but weren't immediately concerned. As evening wore on with no sign of the divers, concern grew into alarm. Emergency services were notified and a search and rescue operation began. Cave diving rescue teams were called in with powerful lights and specialized equipment. Shortly before 2 a.m. on April 20th, the search teams made the tragic discovery. The 3 bodies were found deep in the cave zone, far beyond the safe area. Bayano Cave Incident. On November 21, 2021, 16 people entered a cave near Lake Bayano in Panama. The group included 11 locals from Panama, 1 Canadian tourist, and 4 friends from Venezuela. Their guide had been leading cave tours for over 10 years and knew the caves perfectly. The group put on their headlamps and entered the cave entrance for what seemed like a routine tour. Everything started perfectly as the guide pointed out incredible rock formations. But while they were underground, dangerous weather was developing above them. Heavy storm clouds were rolling in fast, carrying massive amounts of water. When it rains hard above ground, all that water flows down into the cave system. The group had been underground for about an hour when their guide suddenly stopped. He tilted his head like he was listening to something that made his blood run cold. The gentle dripping sound always present in caves was getting much louder. The guide shouted instructions for everyone to move to higher ground immediately. Everyone could hear a distant rumbling sound coming from deeper in the cave. The cave was flooding and they were directly in the path of the rushing water. Above ground, the storm was pounding the jungle with devastating force. The guide started yelling instructions to follow him toward higher chambers, but water was pouring in everywhere, transforming the cave before their eyes. The limestone floors that had been easy to walk on were now slick as ice. The water was rising fast and the current was getting stronger every second. The guide was checking on each member, making sure nobody got left behind. He reached back to help one of the Venezuelan tourists navigate a treacherous section, but the cave floor was so slippery from all the rushing water. In that split second, his foot slipped and he fell hard. His headlamp went flying and smashed against the cave wall. The current grabbed him immediately and swept him toward the darkness. The group tried to save him by forming a human chain. Their guide managed to grab onto a rock in the rushing water. For a brief moment, it looked like they might pull him to safety, but the rock was wet and the current was relentless. His grip slipped, and in that instant, he was gone. Even as the water carried him away, he shouted instructions to save the group. 15 people were now trapped in a flooding cave with no guide and limited light. Above ground, a local man who had waved at them grew worried and contacted contacted emergency services. Back inside the cave, the water kept rising with a deafening roar. The Canadian tourist used his camera flash to help light their surroundings. The water was now waist-deep and strong enough to knock people down. As they fought through flooding passages, 2 more people were claimed by the water. A middle-aged Panamanian man lost his footing in the vicious current. A young Venezuelan woman was also swept away as people tried to help. In minutes, they went from 16 excited tourists to 13 terrified survivors. The remaining 13 somehow managed to keep going through the nightmare. They climbed over rocks and pulled each other through flooded passages. Their headlamp batteries were dying, adding another layer of terror. They spent hours in freezing water in almost complete darkness. Eventually, the 13 survivors found their way to a higher chamber. They were exhausted, freezing, and traumatized beyond belief. When rescue teams finally reached them, they had been through hell. All 13 survivors emerged from the cave alive, but forever changed. The guide's body was recovered the next day, along with the 2 other victims. Lookout Mountain Cave Incident. On Monday morning, March 2nd, 2022, 2 young men stood at an unmarked cave on Lookout Mountain, Tennessee. Gabriel Vaughn, 21, and Robbie Dobos, 23, knew they shouldn't be there because of clear no trespassing signs, but the lure of unexplored darkness proved too strong to resist. The cave system was a multi-level labyrinth that stretched for miles underground. Most explorers knew to bring proper gear for the infamous 600-foot crawl deep within the system. Gabriel and Robbie had neither experience nor proper equipment. They only had headlamps, regular clothes, and the reckless confidence of youth. The entrance welcomed them with cool, damp air and the scent of ancient stone. Gabriel led the way with his footsteps echoing off wet stone walls. They felt like explorers discovering a new world, unaware of the dangers ahead. Hours passed unnoticed as they marked their route casually with small stones. The passages grew more complex with tunnels branching off in multiple directions. Then came the crawl where the passage narrowed dramatically to belly-crawling size. Water seeped constantly through limestone cracks, creating a shallow stream. For 600 feet, they wriggled forward through the claustrophobic tunnel. Cold water penetrated every layer of clothing, stealing precious body heat. When they emerged into a larger chamber, their bodies were shaking uncontrollably. Hypothermia had begun during the brutal crawl as wet clothes clung like ice. Disorientation set in as passages looked identical under weakening lights. Their casual trail markers seemed to have vanished, or they couldn't recognize them. Fear crept in as battery levels dropped and headlamps dimmed to faint glows. They wandered for hours through identical passages, growing weaker and more confused. Seeking shelter, they huddled together in a small chamber deep underground. Tuesday came and went while they remained trapped in their underground prison. Tuesday evening, worried families contacted the Chattanooga Fire Department. 2 young men had failed to return from unauthorized cave exploration. The rescue lieutenant knew the cave intimately after 15 years of service. Her team assembled with specialized equipment for the notorious 600-foot crawl. The search began immediately, but the cave system was vast with miles of passages. The rescue was complicated by active railway lines that could destabilize rocks. Rescuers coordinated with railway dispatch to minimize dangerous train traffic. The team split into groups, calling out and listening for responses through the night. At 3:45 a.m. on Wednesday morning, rescuers found voices echoing from the farthest section. Gabriel and Robbie were discovered nearly 2 miles from the entrance. They were conscious but severely hypothermic after over 36 hours underground. Rescuers immediately provided warm clothing and emergency food supplies. The young men were weak but able to walk with assistance. The journey back required going through the same 600-foot crawl again. Rescue team members guided them through the narrow passage with encouragement. Emergency heat packs prevented hypothermia from worsening during extraction. Norfolk Southern had to halt train traffic for several hours during rescue operations. By dawn Wednesday, Gabriel and Robbie emerged from the cave entrance. Paramedics waited with warming blankets and hot beverages for immediate care. Both young men recovered fully but faced potential criminal trespassing charges. Fool's Crawl Cave Incident. Yale was a young pit bull dog who loved to explore. His family took him on a trip to a cave called Fool's Crawl. Yale smelled something interesting and broke free from his leash. He ran straight into the dark cave before anyone could stop him. His owners were very scared because the cave was dangerous. Fool's Crawl Cave had narrow tunnels and deep water pools that could trap people. The owners called park workers for help right away. The park workers called Tom Engel, a cave rescue expert. Tom brought 2 helpers named Emily Davis and Mike Warner. They arrived at the cave at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Emily put on a wetsuit and took dog treats with her. She went into the dark cave with only a flashlight. Emily walked 300 feet into the cave and found Yale, but Yale was very scared and growled at her with his teeth showing. Emily backed away slowly so Yale wouldn't attack her. She came back to tell the others that Yale was too afraid. The team decided Yale's owner should go in to get his dog. Mike gave his cave gear to Yale's owner. Emily and the owner went back into the cave together. They found Yale 100 feet deeper in the cave. When Yale heard his owner's voice, his tail started wagging. Yale ran to his owner and licked his face happily. The owner put a leash on Yale, but Yale wanted to leave right away. Yale led his owner out of the cave very quickly. They came out of the cave at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Everyone cheered cheered because Yale was safe and not hurt. Yale's family promised to keep him away from caves forever. Manchester Hole Cave Incident. Students from Tadcaster Grammar School went on a school trip to an outdoor center. Joseph, Amy, and Charlie were three friends who were 13 and 14 years old. They joined a group of 5 students to explore Manchester Hole Cave. A 17-year-old guide and their math teacher led the group. The students entered the small cave entrance with excitement. Inside, the cave opened into a big chamber with a high ceiling. There was a little bit of water on the floor, but their boots kept them dry. The group walked deeper into the cave through tunnels and rooms. They reached a narrow tunnel that was only wide enough to crawl through. The students crawled on their hands and knees through the 40-foot tunnel. When they reached the second chamber, something was wrong. The water in this chamber was much deeper and reached their knees. The guide was worried because the chamber wasn't supposed to have so much water. There had been no rain, so the guide didn't know where the water came from. The guide told the teacher to lead the students back to safety. The students started crawling back through the narrow tunnel. Suddenly, more water rushed into the tunnel and started flooding it. The students panicked as the water rose faster than they could crawl. Some parts of the tunnel filled completely with water. To get out, the students had to hold their breath and swim underwater. Charlie was brave and dove underwater first to swim through. Amy and Joseph were at the back of the group with the guide. The guide told Amy she had to dive underwater because there was no time. Amy took a deep breath and swam through the dark, flooded tunnel. The guide grabbed Amy's arm and pulled her to safety. When Amy looked around, Joseph was not there. Joseph had been right behind Amy but got trapped when the last air pocket disappeared. The tunnel was completely filled with water and Joseph couldn't breathe. The other students and teachers made it out of the cave safely. They saw clear skies and realized there had been no rain. Wind at a nearby reservoir had caused water to spill over a dam. Thousands of gallons of water rushed into the river and flooded the cave. Emergency crews came quickly, but it was too late to save Joseph. They found Joseph's body in the flooded tunnel. Cool Caves Incident. Cool Caves in Pennsylvania is not really a cave, but an old abandoned mine. On June 11th, 3 young men aged 18 to 20 went hiking and found the entrance. The entrance was shaped like a keyhole with a narrow opening they had to crawl through. The first friend squeezed through the tight horizontal part and dropped down into the main tunnel. The second friend was the biggest, but he also managed to fit through the opening. The third friend followed without much trouble getting inside. Once past the entrance, the main tunnel was much bigger and they could walk. They explored deeper into the mine for about 150 feet through winding passages. Then they found a section where the passage suddenly narrowed into a hexagonal shape. The tunnel walls formed 6 sides, creating sharp angles and unusual pressure points. The first friend squeezed through the hexagon-shaped opening successfully. He was the smallest, so he made it to the other side. The second friend was bigger and had more trouble with the geometric shape. The 6-sided walls pressed against his body at strange angles. Halfway through the hexagonal passage, the second friend got completely stuck. His chest was wedged between the stone walls and he couldn't move forward or backward. The angular walls caught his ribs and clothing, trapping him in place. The first friend tried to crawl back to help, but there was no room in the narrow space. The trapped friend started to panic and his breathing became fast and shallow. The third friend was still in the main tunnel and could move freely. He decided to crawl out of the mine and call emergency services for help. The rescuers had to crawl through the keyhole entrance with their equipment. They crawled 150 feet through the mine tunnel to reach the trapped friends. The rescue team decided to use soap and water to help free the trapped man. They put soap around his chest and ribs to make it slippery. This would reduce friction so he could slide backward through the passage. The rescue work was very slow and had to be done carefully. For 2 agonizing hours, the rescue team worked to free the trapped friend. Finally, the soap worked and he could compress his chest slightly. Inch by inch, he slid backward through the hexagonal passage. When he finally broke free, everyone felt great relief. Both friends still had to crawl 150 feet back to the entrance. They squeezed through the keyhole opening and reached safety on the surface. The whole underground rescue took 2 hours with professional help. The second friend had scrapes and bruises but was treated and recovered. All 3 young men were shaken but grateful to be alive. Later, they learned the hexagonal passage was made for moving mining equipment with pulleys. It was never designed for humans to pass through safely.